Welcome. My name is Lisa Field, and I'm the president of the Labor Guild. Thank you for joining the Labor Guild's Conversation Corner, where we discuss issues of interest to the labor management community. Tonight, I am joined by Caddie Nath-Folsom, Director of Legal Services at Dove Incorporated. Our conversation tonight is about domestic and partner violence, applicable laws, resources, and the advocacy that Dove provides. Thank you so much, Caddie, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Of course. Thank you, Lisa. I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you to everyone who's joining us on the Facebook Live or through recording. I'm here tonight to talk to you about domestic violence and the legal protections that are in place for survivors of domestic violence in terms of employment and leave that may be necessary in the aftermath of a domestic violence event or leaving an abusive relationship. So with that, I will just go ahead and jump right in. And view. Maybe I could do in advance. All right, so today's agenda is to cover what is domestic violence, looking at the dynamics that define abusive relationships, talking about understanding what are the legal systems that survivors navigate in the aftermath of a domestic violence incident or leaving an abusive relationship, sometimes during abusive relationships, and then getting into the nuts and bolts of talking about the Massachusetts statute that protects survivors at work and specifically provides for leave from work for those who are experiencing domestic violence and their family members. And then finally, we'll talk about how you can help support domestic violence survivors and their family members in your workplace, whether you're in a management role, in an HR role, or just talking about supporting your colleagues and coworkers. So let's start with understanding domestic violence. So this is what we in the field call the power and control wheel. And it's a way of thinking, it's a useful tool for thinking about the dynamics of a domestic violence relationship and how domestic violence plays out in the context of intimate partner relationships. And the point here is to see that it is not any particular behavior that defines an abusive relationship. Instead, it is the goal of a behavior to exert power and control over the victim. And by definition, I think these days people talk about, there being mutual violence in relationships and abusive dynamics going both directions. And it is true that there are sometimes, unhealthy or toxic relationships where there may be abusive behaviors on both sides. But for a relationship to, satisfy the definition of intimate partner abuse, there is by definition one person who is exerting power and control over the other person. And the ways that that happens can be as different as the relationship, as the relationships are. So these are just some of the tools that we know that abusers often use in order to exert power and control over survivors. And so, you see on here, physical abuse, emotional abuse, economic abuse. Those are things we talk about often. I think we talk less often about, legal coercion, using children, certainly isolation. Those are all tools for exerting control over someone. It's also important to note that domestic violence is not one incident. It is a pattern of behavior that happens over a course of time to create a dynamic of power and control over the survivor. And behaviors that in a healthy relationship would not be problematic become problematic when in the context of a domestic violence relationship, when they're used to exert power and control. And so an example that we use at Dove is thinking about the idea of tracking location on a cell phone, right? In a healthy relationship, that can be a way of keeping in touch with your partner, knowing when they're on their way home, so you can ask them to stop at the store and, so they don't, worry if their routine has changed a little bit and they're not, where you expect them to be at the time you expect them and things are running late. That can be a totally normal and healthy behavior. Tracking location can also be a really unhealthy and abusive behavior if the intent is to exert control over someone. And so that's where we kind of just sort of try to take the focus away from the behavior. Is it physical abuse, right? Is there physical violence happening? Because the intent behind a behavior, including physical violence, can be self-defense. It can be, there can be a lot of different things going on there. And so we're looking really for power and control. All right. These are just a few common misconceptions about domestic violence that can be helpful to touch on. I don't know how much screen. Move this over here. The first is that domestic violence is a gendered phenomenon. It's something that men do to women. It is true that statistically, most people who experience domestic violence identify as women, but a significant proportion do not. And it's important that that is something that is recognized, because we don't want survivors to get lost because they don't fit a stereotypical mold of what we think of as a survivor of domestic violence. It's also important to note that domestic violence can happen in both heterosexual and same-sex relationships. Another common myth, one I hope we're working past, but this is always an ongoing conversation, is that survivors can end domestic abuse by leaving the relationship, when in fact what we know is that statistically, the moment of ending a relationship or attempting to end a relationship is an incredibly dangerous time for a survivor. And that is the reason that many survivors don't leave sooner, is because they're aware on some level that that is a really dangerous thing to be doing. And finally, survivors who stay in abusive relationships are weak or are accepting the abuse. The truth is that the average survivor has to attempt to leave an abusive relationship up to 7 times, or sorry, on average 7 times. So sometimes it's more than 7 attempts before they're actually successful. So if you know someone who is in a relationship and you're feeling like, why don't they just leave? Maybe they're trying, maybe they have tried in the past, but there are a lot of social factors at play that can make that incredibly difficult. Finally, I just wanted to kind of throw some numbers up for us that can be useful, just to look at the proportions of people who experience domestic violence. I think those of us who have not, at least not known that we know someone who has experienced domestic violence might wonder at how common it is. But the reality is that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience severe physical violence at some point in their lives. And 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced sexual assault, physical abuse, or stalking by an intimate partner at some point in their lives. So if you think about those numbers, you almost certainly know someone who has experienced these things, and you almost certainly will know more people. And if that happens in the context of work or an employment situation, that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, and how, how to understand and relate with that. All right. Next, I just want to talk about some of the legal systems that survivors of domestic violence are often forced to navigate. Sometimes they choose to navigate these systems, but oftentimes it's being kind of thrown into a legal system without a lot of guidance and without a lot of choice in the matter. The point of talking about this is so those of us who are fortunate enough not to have had to go through this can understand the many legal systems and demands that are being placed on a survivor by multiple overlapping systems. And so we may think, you had a court hearing last week. Why do you have to miss work again today? Why are they constantly out? Why are they constantly calling in? And the reality, is that they're dealing with overlapping systems. So the first I'm going to talk about is the criminal legal system. It's perhaps the most obvious. Of course, survivors are going to be dealing with the criminal legal system if there are criminal charges against an abuser for an assault and battery, for any number of crimes that survivors or abusers might commit against survivors. And that can involve having to attend meetings with police and prosecutors, meetings and communication with victim witness advocates, required appearances in court to give testimony, and other demands on survivors' time and energy. And then by the same token, or the other side of that token, can be criminal charges against the survivor. What we know is that many abusers will use the criminal justice system as a weapon or a tool of their abuse, calling the police on survivors, making accusations against survivors in order to gain a position of further control and greater leverage in other proceedings, or just in the home. And that can create an incredible amount of burden and stress and time on the survivor as well, including potentially being arrested or having to attend clerk magistrate hearings, arraignment, bond, and regular court dates. There are going to be more court dates if it's your own criminal proceeding versus somebody else's. There may be pretrial restrictions, which could potentially affect your ability to work, right? And as well as trial preparation, meetings with attorneys and experts. All right. Another legal system that survivors are often having to interact with are child protective services. In Massachusetts, allowing a child to be exposed to domestic violence, even if you are the victim of that violence, is a form of legal neglect, if you can believe that. So the survivor is actually blamed for being abused because the abuse happens in front of the children. And of course, there oftentimes are allegations of child abuse and neglect by the abuser as well, that may come from within the home, that may come from outside the home, depending on what people around the family are seeing. And so if the family becomes involved with the Department of Children and Families, which is our child protective services agency here in Massachusetts, they're going to have a lot of additional demands on their time. They're going to be required to attend meetings with DCF workers, they may be required to coordinate required meetings and appointments for the children if they're required to get the kids into therapy or their evaluations happening. They also could be required by their DCF worker to physically separate from the abuser, which involves moving, takes a lot of time, loss of a home, major financial changes in financial circumstances for the family, all of these things that can be taking up your time and energy and affecting your work life as well. Sometimes DCF workers also require survivors to go to court and get a restraining order as part of, showing that they're complying with the benchmarks or the requirements that DCF is expecting of them in order to maintain or regain custody of the children. There might be requirements to complete classes. Again, that can take time and energy away from other normal commitments, and as well as visits from the children if they've been removed from the home. And there could be care and protection court hearings going on if the children have been removed from the home. Some of the other systems that survivors are often interacting with are the family court system, particularly if a survivor has recently left the relationship and therefore are dealing with a separation. That almost always is going to land in the probate and family courts, where there's going to be either a divorce proceeding or a custody matter dealing with custody, parenting time, child support. That's going to involve a ton of time and energy for the survivor attending hearings. In the family court, hearings are scheduled. They can be scheduled at 9 in the morning, and you just wait all day until your case is called. You have no control over that. So there's really no way for you to say, I'm going to take the morning off of work, but I'll be back at work in the afternoon, because you just don't know when your case is going to be called. You're at the mercy of the court. And that becomes even more complicated if you're waiting for interpreters. The family court is pretty low on the priority list for interpreters, so that can further delay hearings. So court time can take up a lot of time for families. You're also going to have meetings and phone calls with attorneys. You may have meetings with guardian ad litem, who's doing evaluations for the court, evaluators, therapists, and other experts as you're preparing the case. And then as the court is placing orders in place to make arrangements for this new family system, there also will be the coordination of parenting plans. Who's dropping the kids off at school? Who's picking them up? Who's, where is camp? How far away is it? And those things can really affect a parent's schedule as well, and may be something that we see reflected as their coworkers or as their supervisors at work. Similarly, restraining orders, a lot of the same burdens and demands on survivors' time, including hearings. These hearings are often separate from the family court hearings. It can be in a completely different court system that the restraining order is being heard from the family court case, as well as meetings and phone calls with attorneys. And if there's a restraining order either for or against the survivor, that can involve moving. It can involve losing your home. It can be coordination of parenting plans if suddenly you're separated from the other parent of the children. So all of this is placing a tremendous burden. And again, think about being involved in these are layered on top of each other. So you can be involved in multiple systems. Most survivors are. So it's not just one set of hearings, it's 4 or 5 for different court systems. or legal systems. And similarly, immigration systems might be implicated if there is a loss or change to a pending immigration status following a separation from an abuser. That involves, more time and commitments, meetings with attorneys and therapists and evaluators. And similarly, housing court. Oftentimes we see survivors who have recently separated from an abuser, and that has so changed the family's financial circumstances that they're no longer able to pay their rent. But because Massachusetts is in a housing crisis, there isn't really anywhere else for them to go. So they're starting to fall behind on rent because they don't have the financial contribution from the abuser to be able to pay the rent that they were previously paying. And so they may be facing eviction proceedings and having to go to court to deal with that, as well as, the incredible, like as we've talked about, losing the home, moving, major changes to family finances. So again, the reason for all that is just to talk about and understand how incredibly complicated and demanding these legal systems and legal obligations survivors are facing can be. And so that we can have a sense of like the reality when someone's saying that they need time off, this is why. They may need a lot of time off. It's not just one hearing to get divorced. It is a lot of different systems to be navigating and a lot of different changes to be navigating for the family. And all of that is to say nothing. These are just the required, legal demands, right? This is to say nothing for like the need for therapy, children's need for therapy, the need to just be able to spend time with family and support systems to help you get back on your feet. All of those things that survivors also need beyond what's going to be required of them by legal systems. All right. So what we're building up to talking about here is the need for domestic violence, what I'm going to call domestic violence leave. And we're going to dive into that term a little bit more deeply. But I'm going to kind of call it that just for the purposes of our conversation today. The concept behind domestic violence leave, and it's Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 149, Section 52E in Massachusetts, but many states have similar statutes. So if you're not in Massachusetts, check your state laws. You can usually figure this out with some pretty simple Googling. Many states have similar protections for domestic violence survivors to acknowledge the time that may need to be taken away from work and leave that might be necessary to deal with some of these systems. And so what is protected in Massachusetts? And I'm going to be talking specifically in Massachusetts about Massachusetts law because I am a Massachusetts attorney and I'm not licensed to talk about other states. But if you are in a different state, look up your local laws. You will be able to find information about this online. It is out there. And oftentimes the state statutes are intentionally created to be pretty similar to one another. So, all right. So in Massachusetts, the domestic violence leave statute requires covered employers to allow employees who have experienced abuse or whose family members have experienced abuse, that's important, we'll come back to it, to take up to 15 days off to address issues directly related to the abusive behavior. So who are the covered employers? In Massachusetts, an employer who has 50 or more employees, regardless of whether it's a public or a private entity, is subject to this particular statute and does have to provide the 15 days of leave. We're going to talk a little bit more about how that 15 days can be structured. But one thing that I think is notable about the Massachusetts statute that may not be true in every state is that it's not just the survivor who is entitled to leave. It is the survivor and their close family members who are entitled to leave. And that is because we acknowledge the reality that abuse doesn't just happen to one person, that survivors really do depend on their community and their support system during this really difficult time. And so an abusive situation can actually be really, it can put a strain not only on the survivor, but on their family members as well. And so the family members are also entitled to leave if they have one of these relationships with the survivor, including, of course, a parent or guardian, a sibling, a child or stepchild of the survivor, a grandparent of the survivor or grandchild of the survivor, a spouse, a person in a substantive dating or engagement relationship with the survivor so long as they live together, or a person who shares a child in common with the survivor, regardless of whether they live together. So these are the close relationships that would entitle someone to take leave under the domestic violence leave statute for the domestic violence or abuse experiences of a family member. Right. How much leave does an employer have to provide? It's up to 15 days in any 12-month period. So if we're talking about, between March and March, you would count to 15 days, but then the following April, you'd have to look back to the following April to be counting how many days can be taken. This is like blocking anybody. There we go. That's better. What kind of leave does the employer have to provide? I think that the statute is pretty friendly to employers in this regard. It actually provides employers with a pretty good range of options. So the employer gets to decide whether the leave is paid or unpaid. And the employer can also, although they don't have to, require that the employee exhaust all other paid leave before they take the domestic violence leave. So you can have a requirement that if an employee has 5 days of vacation time left, they need to use up their vacation time before they start taking the DV leave. You do still have to provide the 15 days of DV leave, but you can require that, so maybe they can get the things they need to get done with their 5 days of vacation. One important thing to note is that employees must be allowed to use earned sick time if that is something that the employer provides towards the domestic violence leave. So if you're an employer who says, no, we're not going to provide paid leave, if you're going to take the 15 days, you're going to take it unpaid, you do have to allow employees to opt to use their sick time first to continue to be paid. So that is one point to note there. What are the reasons that employees can take domestic violence leave from work? So the statute, I think, is intentionally broad. It ends with this sort of catch-all that says to address other issues directly related to the abusive behavior. So it provides a list of covered activities that are grounds for taking leave. I can't be there because I need to find new housing. I can't be at work because I need to go to court, or I need to talk to a police officer. But it is not limited to these enumerated activities. Really anything that is directly related to the abusive behavior is going to be covered as a valid reason for taking domestic violence leave. So we've got a list here, but seeking medical attention, counseling, victim services, and legal help, securing housing, getting a restraining order, appearing in court or before a grand jury, meeting with police or prosecutors, attending child custody proceedings if DCF is involved with the family, and addressing other issues related to the abusive behavior. All right, next question. Does the employee have to provide proof that their family member they or their family member experienced abuse? The answer is yes. Employers can request that an employee provide within a reasonable period of time, which is 30 days from the last day of the leave, documentation showing that they or the family member that they're naming as the survivor have experienced abuse. However, the employee is only required to provide one document. So the employer can't demand, any particular document. Anything from this list here will do and has to be accepted. And the employer can't require multiple forms of proof. So if the survivor can provide, or the family member of the survivor can provide any of these documents, the employer does have to accept that as valid documentation of the abuse. And the valid documentation can be a restraining order, a police report or victim statement, medical records related to treatment for the abuse, documentation of the criminal conviction of the perpetrator. You cannot require that the survivor provide proof of conviction. But if they have it, that is a form of documentation or proof that can be acceptable. Document under letterhead of the court provider, public agency that the survivor attended for the purposes of getting help. So for example, I think if they come to Dove and seek services from us, we can write them a letter, and then that can be evidence of abuse. As well as a sworn statement from a professional who's assisted in addressing the effects of the abuse. So that can be a lawyer, it can be a mental health professional, it can be a counselor, a DV advocate. Again, folks at Dove would be able to do that, or a sworn statement from the survivor themselves. So if you are a survivor and you're thinking, I don't have any of that, your sworn statement alone is enough under the law to qualify for the domestic violence leave. Does the employee have to give notice that they are taking leave? The short answer is yes, they do have to provide notice. Notice of leave should be given in accordance with the employer's normal leave policy. So whatever leave you're required to give when you take a vacation, you should also try to give that much leave or that much notice when you are going to be taking domestic violence leave. So if you know a court date is coming up in 3 months, you should definitely give your employer a heads up according to their leave policy requirements. However, because the statute is acknowledging the sometimes emergent needs of survivors, if there is an imminent danger to the health or safety of an employee, they have up to 3 days after taking the leave or after beginning the leave to notify the employer that they're taking leave due to domestic violence against themselves or a family member. So in emergency situations where there's a danger to health or safety, you do have some time, take the leave that you need. You can provide the paperwork and documentation and notice to your employer of that leave afterward if you need to. And the law does protect you. Does domestic violence leave apply only in situations involving intimate partner abuse? The answer is no. The statute is quite complicated, actually. I think it's sort of confusing in the way it's written, but when you parse it, it's pretty clear that there is a definition of abuse that applies to acts committed by someone who is or has been an intimate partner or another family member, right? A close family member. And the things that constitute abuse if committed by an intimate partner or family member include causing or attempting to cause physical harm, putting someone in fear of imminent serious physical harm, forced sex or sexual assault, mental abuse, including threats or intimidation, depriving the survivor of medical care, housing, food, or other necessities of life, or restraining the survivor's liberty. So that's actually a pretty good legal definition of abuse. It's pretty broad. We tend to see definitions of abuse in the law that really limit things to like physical and sexual abuse only. This is a little bit broader, does include other forms of abuse. I will note that there's a new statute that just passed the Massachusetts legislature this year and has been signed. It will go into effect in September. It's currently August, that will change the definition of abuse to include coercive control. That's really outside the scope of this presentation, so I'm not going to go into it, but my read of that statute with this statute is that the definition of abuse in that statute does not change the definition of abuse in this statute. So it is my opinion, and I think this would probably have to be tested in court, that this definition will continue to stand and be the definition of abuse for the purposes of the domestic violence leave statute going forward after September of 2024. Whereas the definition of abuse that will get you a restraining order is going to be changing and actually broadening a lot to cover a lot more types of abusive behavior that are, again, focused on coercive control as opposed to hitting or physical violence, right? But I just wanted to note that because it is kind of an added complexity if you're thinking about this statute. But I would go with this definition unless you talk to an attorney who's really familiar with your case and this law and says something differently. So that's if you experience abuse by an intimate partner or family member. However, if you experience stalking, sexual assault, or kidnapping by anyone, that can constitute abuse for the purposes of the statute and allow you to take leave under the domestic violence leave statute. So just know that if there's, it has to meet the legal definition for those crimes for stalking, sexual assault, or kidnapping, but it does not have to be someone you ever knew. It can be a stranger. So just something to keep in mind. Employees' rights when taking leave due to domestic violence. So obviously you have the right to take these 15 days, but what does that mean? It means that if you take that time off, the employer cannot fire an employee or lay them off, cannot discriminate against an employee for taking that leave, similar to the FMLA statute in that regard. The employer can't punish an employee or demote them or otherwise take away benefits, earned employee benefits, childcare, insurance, comp time, or retirement. And you also, the employer can't make the taking of leave conditional on the abuser or on the survivor leaving the relationship. So the statute does not allow employers, and this is an important thing to be aware of for employers, it doesn't allow the employers to really have any say in what's happening in the domestic violence relationship. And it, so that's just an important thing to note about that. The leave is, if you can provide evidence of the need for the leave, there can't be any other conditions on that. So I'm getting a question here. Are local police responsive? I think, that's hard for me to say because I don't, I can talk about Quincy police, like, in Dove's local area, but it depends on where you are. I would say generally speaking that if you feel like you're in danger, oops. Okay, I'm getting another question here. If you feel like you are in danger, we do encourage people to call police if you feel safe doing so. If you do not feel safe calling the police, and we know that some people don't, and you feel like you need somewhere to go, you can always go to a hospital. And in Massachusetts, hospitals will provide beds to domestic violence survivors who are fleeing domestic violence. And it's a tough environment for finding a domestic violence shelter, but the hospitals are there if you need a bed for the night and you need somewhere safe to go. And then I'm getting another question here. Are local police responsible for enforcing U visa protections? Is any other office in the Commonwealth responsible for enforcing the U visa protections? Yeah, I'm happy to talk about U visa protections. I'm going to go ahead and continue on with the DV statute, the DV leave statute, and I will come back to that in the end if we have some time. I'm happy to chat about that. Okay. That I had looking at the statute is domestic violence leave available to perpetrators of abuse if they qualify as the family member of a victim? Because remember, the family member of the victim can include the spouse of the victim or the intimate partner of the victim or someone who shares a child with the victim. The answer is no. The perpetrator of the abuse is specifically and very clearly exempt from domestic violence leave protection. So it's not going to work. And the statute does not protect against that or does not allow for that. All right, so this was a lot of information fairly quickly, and believe it or not, I didn't even cover everything. So if you have additional questions or you want to learn more about this statute, there are a lot of resources available online. For employees in Massachusetts, I recommend masslegalhelp.org, not only for this information about this statute, but for a lot of information related to navigating legal systems as a survivor of domestic violence, or if you know someone or love someone who is experiencing domestic violence. There are just a ton of resources on masslegalhelp.org, and they're all designed for people who are not lawyers. It's intended for people who don't trying to navigate these systems. For an employer, if you're looking at, how do I make sure that I'm, complying with the statute and supporting my staff? There is a great advisory on mass.gov from the Attorney General's office. They're generally like the administrators of the statute. And so there's some great information there for you. It's pretty succinct and reasonable to get through, not difficult. This thing we're going to talk about today, and I'm doing on time, which is so unlike me. The last thing we're going to talk about today, is how to support the people in your life, particularly the people at work, and around you in the workplace, if you think that they are experiencing domestic violence, or if they tell you that they are experiencing domestic violence. And we're going to go through some like tips and, advice for anyone who is confronted with someone that who's sharing something like this with you. And then we're going to talk specifically about things that employers can do, and then specifically things that you can do for coworkers. So for anyone, if someone tells you that they have experienced domestic violence or are experiencing domestic violence, the place to start is to believe them. One of the biggest fears and anxieties that survivors often have is that they have no proof. Domestic violence is something that happens behind closed doors. Oftentimes abusers are really good at convincing the people in their community that they are someone who would never do something like this. And so it can be such an incredibly powerful and validating thing just to start from a place of, I believe you. I'm not questioning or asking you to prove that this happened to you. If the survivor is not coming to you with this information, but you have seen warning signs and you're worried that this person in your life may be experiencing something at home, and they're unsafe, and you want to talk with them about it, you're starting from a more difficult place because they may not be ready to talk to you about it. But if that is a conversation you want to have, we recommend starting with observations. I've noticed this happening. I've seen this. It seems like you might be going through this, right? And starting with just offering some observations and letting the survivor know that you're a safe place. You're someone they can talk to. You're there for them. And without in any way trying to force or compel them to tell you information that they may not be ready to share yet. We've talked about how challenging and how dangerous it can be for survivors to try to leave relationships, to try to reach out for support, particularly when an abuser is using isolation as a tactic or a technique. So just, it may take time to build up that trust, and just you're doing a lot just by letting them know you see them and that you're there to talk with them. Another important thing to do is that if they do disclose to you, to listen without judgment, to avoid asking, why aren't you leaving? How can you allow this to happen in your home? Anything like that would suggest that the survivor has control or, the ability to stop this or responsibility to stop this. Just listening without judgment is a really powerful thing. You need to be okay with not understanding everything. Survivors may not be ready to tell you the whole story. They may not be able to tell you the whole story. Trauma can affect different people in different ways. It can affect memory, it can affect judgment, it can affect executive functioning, it can affect people's ability to tell stories in a linear fashion. And so you oftentimes will not be getting all the information, especially in that first conversation, and maybe not at all, right? There may be things that the survivor is just not ready to tell you. And so their decisions may not make any sense because you don't have all the information, and certainly you may not be able to understand what it was actually like for them to be going through the experiences that they were going through. So it has to be okay to know, I don't have all the information here. I don't know what this person went through. I need to just kind of accept that these are the decisions that they made, and how do we look forward from here? We also really encourage leading with curiosity. Survivors often need help and support from their communities in so many different ways. And a big thing for survivors is, where do you find the community that can offer you that support if you've been isolated, right? If you've been isolated from friends, if you're geographically or, emotionally isolated from family, who is the person that can help, pick you up for an appointment with your DV counselor if, you're not allowed to drive, the abuser controls access to the car? Who is the person that can help you set up an email account that the abuser doesn't know about if they check your devices and your accounts? So there can be a lot of different ways that a survivor needs help, and small things that we can do for them that can be really useful and valuable. And so, an example is, here, set up an email account on my phone, right? Let me, if you need to like send money out of a savings account, do it through my Venmo. You're like, can I pick up the kids after school today? I'm going to be passing by there anyway. So realistic offers of help, right? That are things you can feasibly do, because it is not your job to try to save them or try to fix everything, but asking, how can I help? And there might be really small but important things that they need that you would never have known about. So just creating that opportunity. Stay connected with someone if they have disclosed to you that they're a survivor of abuse. Isolation is such an important part of maintaining control. The more that is undermined, the better chance the survivor has of being able to leave the relationship, if they have that community. And finally, don't try to direct outcomes or decisions. Again, at the very core of domestic violence is control. And so the ability to take back control, to be able to have power over decisions and autonomy in their lives is a really important thing for survivors, as they're trying to make decisions about how to cope with the abuse that they're experiencing. So not imposing, you have to do this. Oh my gosh, you need to do this. You've got to call the police, that those kind of things can be, again, you don't have all the information about the abuser, about the survivor, about the family dynamic. And what I always say to my clients is that they're the experts in their family and their abuser. They know how to survive because they've been doing it. So we always defer to their judgment and their knowledge of how to stay safe. Some tips for employers on how to support a survivor if they disclose to you that this is something that they're experiencing. And I'm working with a survivor right now who has an incredible employer who has been so supportive to her throughout her relationship. And, she's someone who doesn't have family in the United States, and her boss and her community at work have been her support system. It's just so incredible. So don't think that you can't, as a boss, be there for, or as an employer or supervisor, be there for your employees in this way. If you have that trust and they confide in you, you absolutely can be an important pillar of support for them. So the first and most important thing is to think about safety at work, right? And that might look different for different employers, for different workplaces, but is there a need to know, what the abuser looks like, what car they drive, to be able to identify if they come onto company property? Is there a need to change the location where someone works, or change their hours around a little bit to provide for their safety? Is there a need for them to be able to signal to you that something is not right, or for you to know that if they don't show up for work, you should be worried, right? So what safety plans can you put in place with them? And that there's no way for me to give you a roadmap for that. The survivor will be the one to give you that roadmap, because they will know their situation, and a lot will depend on what's going on within your workplace, and what the safety mechanisms are there. In the same vein, offering flexibility whenever possible. There's really two components to that, right? There's the safety component, which is maybe, it's safer for this particular survivor to work evenings because it reduces the amount of time that they have to be at home with the abuser. Or maybe it's safer for the survivor to be able to work at this location versus this location, because they've recently separated and the survivor doesn't know about, or the abuser doesn't know about this this other location where they could be working. So just working at different, so safety concerns, but also understanding trauma, right? And this goes into the next one, which is just being conscious of trauma responses. And so I want to be careful when I'm talking about trauma to be clear that for those of us, myself included, who have experienced trauma, this is not, it is in no way to say that that trauma somehow breaks you, that it somehow makes you less prepared to be a completely, powerful and autonomous adult in any way. But it is also important for the world at large to recognize the way that trauma affects the brain, and the way it may affect survivors that you're interacting with. And so what we know now is that complex trauma that takes place over a long period of time can affect Am I frozen? I'm not frozen. Okay, good. I just want to make sure. It looks like I might be.
Good.
Okay. So it can affect some executive functioning, and there are actually studies now that show that for some domestic violence survivors, the neurological impacts of trauma over time can actually mirror those that, people who've been in combat situations show. So the same, like seeing the same kind of neuroscans and brain activity. And that can affect a lot of different things. It can, as I mentioned, it can affect memory. It can affect storytelling ability. It can oftentimes affect sleep, eating, certainly hypervigilance, feelings of unsafety, or feelings of anxiety that the survivor may be bringing to work with them, that may change some of the things that you've known about their personality. And that's not to say that these are permanent personality changes, but just different behaviors that you wouldn't have expected from this person. Like all of a sudden they don't feel comfortable closing up at night, like, right? They don't feel comfortable being the one to close when they were always fine with closing. In fact, enjoyed it, right? Now they don't feel comfortable doing that alone. So, that hypervigilance. So those can all be very normal responses to trauma. And that is the brain protecting itself and trying to prepare for dangerous situations in the future. And so the more we're conscious of that and flexible around it and understand that these are the oftentimes temporary effects of trauma, the more safe and respectful of an environment we're creating for survivors at work. Which is one story I want to add here is that there was a mental health provider who did an incredible training on trauma a few years ago. And she had worked with a patient who had had a perfect driving record her entire life. And she was in her mid-40s. And she began to experience domestic violence in a relationship. I believe there was sexual violence involved, and began to have repeated traffic issues, particularly accidents. She got into, I think, 9 accidents in an 18-month period after having had no driving problems, never having had an accident before that. And what the provider was able to discern or realize after working with her is that she had lost sense of her body's place in space, right? She had lost the sense of her own like physical space location in space, and that had affected her ability to drive. And so, that just things like that might be someone who for a while may need administrative leave if they're a driver, right? If they're a commercial driver's license, if they have a commercial driver's license or that's their job, right? They may need to be moved to a different position for a little while they're working through therapy and things like that. Another way that trauma can affect some survivors is it makes it really difficult to remember like small clerical things like phone numbers or appointments. And so oftentimes my clients will miss appointments. And we know that that's like a really normal response for people who are recovering from trauma, is that sometimes it's just really hard to keep track of things. Also, you're juggling 18,000 different legal systems, all giving you appointments. So that can just be another thing. So just things to be aware of. Another thing that you can do as an employer is to accept the statute's invitation to be a survivor allied workplace. I feel like this statute was like, we're not going to make you do this, but if you want to, that's great, right? And so what are the things you can do as an employer to accept that invitation to be a survivor allied workplace? One big thing is to make the leave paid, right? To just offer as a policy paid domestic violence leave. I don't think it's going to be something that happens that frequently. And it could be an incredibly powerful thing that may actually help a survivor get to safety faster, and then allow them, to be back to themselves and back to being that incredible employee that and count on. So in a faster way. So there are benefits to that, right? Similarly, not requiring them to exhaust all of their PTO before using the domestic violence leave. So it's heartbreaking to think like, I'm going to have to cancel the vacation that my kids are so excited about because I need to use that vacation time to get everyone into therapy and to get us moved out of our home and to go to 17 different court dates for, 4 or 5 different court cases. So just offering that, allow them to keep their earned leave, keep their vacation time, and just to use the domestic violence leave. So there are really great ways that the statute builds in for employers to be able to opt in and make those decisions for themselves. A big thing, and it's a small thing, but it's a big thing, which is asking the employee what is okay, right? If there's a need for safety precautions at work, is it okay to share broadly that this person, who some people may recognize as a spouse of a coworker, is an unsafe person who's not allowed on the premises, right? What is okay with the survivor? And balancing that with, ensuring safety of everyone in the workplace. But really starting from a place of where they feel comfortable. Certainly maintaining confidentiality. The statute, we didn't go over it in detail because I feel like it's self-explanatory, but the statute is very clear about the confidentiality requirements of the documentation or the evidence that employers can require of the domestic violence. So if you're going to require that the survivor provide proof or one of those documents listed that they have experienced abuse, that does have to be kept confidential. Another thing you can do as an employer is to support the survivor's various legal cases by allowing them to take the leave and offering that flexibility as much as possible. But there are ways to go steps beyond that. This incredible employer, I wish I could name them because I'm so impressed with them. It's just so wonderful how great they were. I'm not going to name them for my clients' privacy reasons. But this employer that is the employer of one of my clients, actually, her supervisor wrote a letter confirming on company letterhead that the survivor had disclosed the abuse, that she'd made the company aware of what she was experiencing and why it was affecting her work and her availability and that kind of thing. And we were able to use that as part of the legal case to document the abuse. So there's ways to even go above and beyond that. And then one last one, I feel like this should be a given, but ensuring that mental health is covered by healthcare plans and checking with your healthcare provider to see if it is covered. And if it isn't, how do we add that into the plan? That's a huge thing for survivors, and being able to get back to work and again, be that incredible employee that you know and count on sooner is having the support and the emotional, the opportunity to do the emotional processing that they need to do. All right. For coworkers, what can you do? I'm just gonna pause really quickly and turn my light on because it's
absolutely dark.
So sorry. Give me 1 second here. Okay, now I'm as purple as my slideshow, but it's good. All right. So as a coworker, if again, a survivor coworker or colleague or friend at work is coming to you and seeming to need to share these things, the most important thing is to let them lead, right? Let them decide when it's time for them to take DV leave, domestic violence leave. Let them decide when it's time to bring the employer in and make a safety plan at work. Let them decide how much they need to tell you about the situation. They may not be prepared to talk about some things as compared to others. So always putting the survivor in the driver's seat and letting them decide what their needs are. Again, supporting safety at work. There may be ways that you can support safety at work without letting the employer know if the survivor feels like they're not ready to bring the employer into the loop on this yet. And so, what should you do if their employer calls the office looking for them, right? If their abuser calls the office looking for them, if the person using abuse in their relationship is calling the office looking for them, what should you do, if they suddenly don't appear for work one day? Who is the person you should call? And should you send someone to the house? Are they comfortable with it being police, or would it be better if it was their mom and you call the mom and send her to the house, right? So just talking with them about ways that you can support their safety to the extent that you feel comfortable and safe doing so. You can talk with them about their rights. You've now sat through a very long presentation on domestic violence leave. A lot of survivors aren't aware that's even an option, and they're struggling and trying to juggle the stress of, meeting all of their same work obligations while they have, the equivalent of another full-time job dealing with legal systems. and they're not aware that like there's a little bit of breathing room there. You can take some leave time, right? Respect privacy. Please don't share with other colleagues and coworkers anything that is shared with you about domestic violence. It just is something that even if the survivor doesn't say it, it has to be kept completely private if they have confided in you. If you do agree to help a survivor, if you do agree to provide some kind of a support, it's crucial that you follow through, both in terms of maintaining that connection and keeping them feeling supported, but also because they're probably counting on that support, right? Survivors have to count on every piece of support, every bit of support that they can, particularly when they're trying to transition out of an abusive relationship. And so it's really important that you not make commitments that you can't follow through on. And finally, check in, just, a text, a quick message, again, in a way that keeps things private. It's probably not a good idea to check in like in the break room at lunch hour, when everybody's around. But just following up, checking in, letting them know you're there if they have more that they need to share, or if something new happens and they need to reach out. Right. So one last thing here, and then I'll get to some questions. For those of you who have found this training valuable or useful and think that it is something that you'd want to learn more about, if you think that you want to be implementing some policies at work to have better awareness and understanding of domestic violence, Dove does offer a 35-hour comprehensive virtual domestic violence training twice a year in the spring and the fall. Our next one will be starting on September 4th. Registration isn't open yet, but we've got the link here, and I believe it's in the comments as well for those who are not watching live, to register. And even if you're watching this 4 years in the future, we probably have another one coming up in the spring, so just check back there, or coming up in the fall, depending on where you are. So just check back there. You can find lots of information about the sessions. It's really comprehensive for what domestic violence looks like, what trauma looks like, how different systems work, working with different communities. So there's a lot of valuable information in those trainings. It's great for all of these different folks and many more. It's also a great thing for survivors too. We have had survivors attend the trainings, and they just bring so much valuable insight to the conversations. And I think it's it's useful for them as well. And then finally, if you are a survivor, if you're experiencing domestic violence, you're not alone. There are supports out there. We at Dove can provide services to survivors in 17 cities and towns in Norfolk County. The legal advocacy program serves all of Norfolk County and actually a little teeny bit of Plymouth County. And if we can't serve you, we will direct you to the domestic violence organization that does serve your area. So give us a call if you need, any of the things listed here. In addition, if you're just feeling like you'd rather not, like local is just too close to home, or if you're not in Massachusetts, there's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. I have many clients that have used it and had wonderful experiences. They provide emotional support, safety planning, local resources, and information about domestic violence. And you can actually get in touch with them by phone, text, or chat. And a lot of my clients have done the chat option. It's just like this really, easy and safe way to be reaching out for support. All right. And so I have this last just quote as a place to end. It occurred to me that people might be wondering, how can I recognize someone in my workplace or in my friend group or in my life that may be experiencing domestic violence? What should I be looking for? Should I be looking for bruises or, limping or, and I think, the thing about domestic violence and that makes it so insidious is that there may not be any signs. I recently had, a friend and someone that I know in a colleague kind of way let me know that she's experiencing domestic violence, and I would never have guessed it. I do this for a living. There was no signs. And so, I think that the one thing we can say that there's a way to recognize domestic violence survivors is by their courage. And so, rather than looking for signs, just trust your gut. If you think that someone is, maybe needing a little extra support in their life, or something might be going on at home, where they might feel safe, just provide opportunities for them to share that with you. And that's the most important thing to do. I just want to circle back to questions. We had a question about whether local police are responsible for enforcing U visa protections. Is any other office in the Commonwealth responsible for enforcing the U visa protections? So for those who don't know, a U visa is a type of, it's a type of immigration relief that is available for people who have been victims of certain kinds of crimes, including domestic violence, and have reported those crimes to law enforcement and cooperated with law enforcement in the subsequent investigation or prosecution. When you say responsible, you know, I'm not sure exactly, you know, as far as enforcing protections, what I think might be meant here is that in order to apply for a visa under the U visa statute, and again, a visa is going to come from the federal immigration authorities. They're really the ones who enforce the statute because they give out this benefit. But in order to apply to them for this benefit, you do have to have a signature from law enforcement on a document that confirms you are a victim of a qualifying crime. It's called certification. And so I think that might be what this person is referring to. And the answer is yes, local police are responsible for certifying, but some police departments refuse to certify, or they refuse to certify in certain cases. For example, if it's, you know, there was never a conviction, or if the victim themselves has any criminal history. So if your local police department will not certify, or the local police department in the place where you live won't certify, there are often other certifiers that might have jurisdiction, other law enforcement agencies that might have jurisdiction to give you that signature that you need. So you can look at state agencies like the state troopers or the Mass Attorney General's office. You can look at, I know DCF can certify, prosecutors can certify, and even judges. I've never seen it happen, but I've heard of it happening, that even a judge, like in a restraining order case, if there was a restraining order violation, could potentially certify once the case is over. So I highly recommend talking with an immigration attorney about this, and reaching out, just reaching out for legal advice with that, because the U visa statute is incredibly complicated, and it's, it's a complex issue. But thank you for that question. All right, and I think those are all the questions.
So I actually have one.
Oh, yeah, great.
So when you were talking about the domestic leave, so this is for employers who have 50 or more employees. Am I understanding that? So
yes.
What happens if you work for an employer that's less than that? Do you have any protections? Is there any leave that you're available to avail yourself of?
Yeah, so I wasn't able to find anything in the law that suggests that there are protections that are required. I would again say that this is an opportunity. It's an invitation for smaller employers to be a survivor allied workplace and to take pride in that and offer that leave even if you don't have to, right? I think the cost is probably going to be minimal to your bottom line, and it creates this like incredibly supportive environment for your employees that will help you keep wonderful employees like my client, who had, this employer who was willing to support her. I also think that there would be a very strong argument to be made that you should be able to take your sick time, that earned sick leave should be able to be used for domestic violence reasons. I didn't see a case that says that, but I think you'd have a good argument.
Great, thank you. So Bruce, there's no more questions, right? We'll just double check with Bruce. Nope, no more questions. He put it in the chat. I want to thank you so much. This was so interesting, and I think that so much good information for folks. So we'll have it again on our YouTube. We also have it on our Facebook page as well. So tomorrow we'll download it onto our YouTube channel so folks can go back and review the slides. And then we did put some links into the chat. But if people want to find out more information about Dove, if you could just reiterate the website for them.
Yes, our website is www.dovema.org. So it's Dove, like Dove, Massachusetts, at dovema.org. And there you can find links to ask for help, phone numbers, a lot of information, places where you can register for trainings, information about if you want to have us come and do a training, at your workplace or, to some group that you're involved with. We offer trainings in that way too. So there's a lot of useful information there.
Terrific. And for more information about the Labor Guild, check out our website at laborguild.com. So thank you very much. And join us again for another Conversation Corner.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa, and everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thanks again, Caddie. Terrific. Thanks.
Sure.